Welcome to this video where we'll add an associated model to our current task model. Now, associated model is a model that has some sort of relationship with our original model, which was tasks, and I'm going to create a notes model. And the kind of relationship that we'll have is a many-to-one relationship, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. But there can also be a many-to-many and a many-to-many through. Now, many-to-many means there's a relationship between two entities, but we don't want to store any information about that relationship. Whereas a many-to-many through means that there is information that we want to store about that relationship. So to create our model, we'll use the bin rels G for generate command, and we'll create a model. And this time I'm going to create a note model. Now remember, you want your model name to be singular. So when you create the controller later on, you'll change that to a plural name. And then the fields. I'm going to have a title, which is going to be a string. So string is default. You could put that on there, but you don't have to since it's a string. And then a body, I'm going to use a text field. This is a multi-line text field. And now remember, if you're taking my class, you need at least 3 fields like this. But now we need to make our relationship. So we want to relate this model to the task model. So we could add a task ID and make that an integer. But Rails has a different way of doing this. So you put the model name, which is a task, and then we say references that task. Now, this is going to do a couple of things. It's going to create that task ID column on this table, but it's also going to add an index on the task ID, so we don't need to add that index ourselves. And also, it's going to put a foreign key constraint on the table to make sure that these note models actually belong to a task. Now, after creating that, of course, it creates us a migration file, which we can see. And you can see it references the task model. It says it can't be null. And it also says that it's a foreign key. So we can go ahead and run that migration with bin rels db migrate. Now looking in the DB folder under the schema, you can actually see what your schema is. Again, you shouldn't edit this file. You should read this comment up here. But we can see that it did add an index on the task ID as part of that migration. And then we can also see that we have the foreign key on notes and tasks. Next, let's go ahead to the note model and go ahead and add some validations. I'm just going to validate that there's a title. Now, entering the console with binrels-c, we can go ahead and see how we can interact with this notes model. Just with the task model, we can create a new note. We can go ahead and set the title and the body. Now, the other thing that we need to set is the task ID. Now, we probably don't want any orphaned notes, notes that don't have a task. So we should probably validate the presence of the task ID as well. I'm not going to do that because that will be accomplished in another way. But right now, if we want to assign this note to a task, we need to look up the task in the database, find out its ID, and then set the task ID equal to that right there. But Ruby on Rails has some helpers to make it a lot easier to be able to set our task ID. And editing the notes model again, we can go ahead and say this belongs to a task. And now that it belongs to a task, we can reload this thing, get another new note. Now this note, I never saved it in the database, so it's gone, but I reloaded the code and now I can create another new note. I can say, set the title and the body. That I have this belongs to a task. We also have a method on this called task, and it'll see what task this belongs to. And we can also say task is equal to. So we can go ahead and get a task out of the database. I'll just get our first task out. You can see that the ID of this task is 1. So then we can say the note.task equals this task that I just pulled out of the database with the task.first right there. Looking at our note, we can see that the ID has been 1. It still hasn't been saved in the database. So we can go ahead and save this note in the database. And that'll run the validations that they all pass. And then It'll be saved in the database and we'll have the task ID set on it without having to worry about figuring out what specific number that is. We can just set it that way. Also, on the task model, we can let it know that it has many notes that belong to it by saying has many, and then we can do notes right here. This is a lot of convention over configuration right here. Because I say has many notes, it knows that there's a note model, and it knows that in the note model, there must be a task ID, so it knows how to write this SQL statement to get all of those notes out. So again, reloading our code in this console here. Now I can say t equals task.first. And because it has belongs to, or because the task has many notes up there, we can say t.notes, and we get an array of all the notes that belong to it. Now there's only one note, but we can tell this is an array by the square brackets. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and exit the console and create our controller for the notes. So we'll do bin rails g controller. And this is a notes controller. And again, this is the plural name of your model. And again, we'll just create the index action to start. So we can open up the notes controller, but let's also open up the routes file and fix the routes. And right now you can see that it added this route right here, but we don't want that. And we do want to add resources notes, just like our task. But the only problem is now all of our URLs. But the problem is all of our URLs will just have our notes and the ID of the note right there. And what we want to do is nest the notes inside of the task. So what we want to do is say tasks, and then we have like the ID of a task, followed by notes, and this would be the URL to get all the notes for this task. And then, of course, we can have an individual note. So note number 5 would hopefully belong to task number 3, and we can see that singular note. So to be able to get this nesting right here, what we do is we add a block onto the end of the resources, and then we include our resources notes inside of that block. Now this I was just showing you what the URLs will look like. If we do that, we don't want to actually include that in our code. And now our notes will be nested underneath our tasks. Inside of our notes controller, we want to load out all the notes. So we could say notes equals notes.all like we did in the task controller, but that will give us all of the notes that belong to all of the tasks. We want to scope this to the notes that just belong to the task that we're viewing. Now, the ID of the task, since we have these nested routes, the ID of the task we're viewing will be in the URL. So we can say notes.where the task ID is equal to the params, and then we have the task ID that's in our URL. Now that means if we have a URL that has tasks and there's some ID right here, and then we'll have notes right here. This will be the URL when this gets called. The task ID will be this part right here, and we'll be able to pull it into there. But we probably also want to load this task out of the database so that we can see the title of the task and display the title of the task on this page. So we might as well load this task out. So we can go at task equals task.find and use our params and do the task ID. We probably want to load this task out of the database for every action in this controller. So the best way to do that is to add a private method, and then we'll call this load task, and we'll just include this line of code or inside the method. To make sure that gets called, we'll use our before action, and we'll just call load tasks or load task. What that means is anytime we call one of these actions right here or a page inside the notes controller, will automatically load out the task that we're working with. And we could simplify this since we already have the task. We could just go at task.id, or maybe even better, what we can do is we can just say at task notes, because we already have this helper method that we got when we added this has many notes onto our task model. It'll give us all the notes that belong to this task. I went ahead and did the HTML for our index view inside of our notes folder, we'll set the title saying notes for, and then we'll print out the title of the task, and then we'll loop through all the notes, printing them out. And just so we can style them easier, we might as well wrap them in a div tag with an ID and the class of note. When we're viewing a task, we're going to want a link to be able to see all the notes. So in our show view for the task, let's go ahead and create that link. So we'll go ahead and link to the notes, and that's the task because there's just one task, notes path. So now we can go to our tasks. We can look at our task that we have in our database, and we have a notes link. And of course, you can style this up and make it look nicer. And we have that console note, the note that we created in our console. And you can see that our title up here has the name of the task. So we'll also add a little bit of navigation on our index view for our notes. We'll add a link to get back to the tasks. And refreshing, and now we have a link to get back to our task. Now we'll also add a link to go to a form to be able to create a new note for this task. And we'll just separate that out with a break tag, but you probably want to do something better with your styling. So we can click on the new note, but we haven't implemented the new action in the controller. Now you can see my new method looks a lot like the task new method. We're just creating a new note. But remember, we still have this before action that is loading the note out of the database. And then creating a new view, we'll set a title, print out the title of the task. And here we need a bootstrap form for not the task only, but also the note. And what we can do is pass in an array of our two models, the task and the note. And Rails is smart enough to generate the right URL to create a new note. It knows this is a note that hasn't been saved, and it knows that this is a task that is saved in the database, and it can generate the right URL to submit this form to. Now you can see I've worked ahead a little bit by adding this persisted, and so we can get the button to change whether we're creating a note or updating a note, or when we use this form to update notes. And of course, we can add a cancel link in case we decide not to create a new note. Now we can see we have a nice form to create a new note, but when we click submit, nothing will happen because we haven't implemented the created action yet. And so just like the create with our task model, we'll go ahead and create a new note with the notes params, and we'll whitelist anything here. So we have our params at spec again. The next thing we want to do is assign the notes task to be the task that got loaded out in this before action filter. However, there is a little bit easier way to do this, and that's with this code. We'll take the task that was loaded out with the before action filter, and we'll go for its notes. And remember, this is an array of notes, or at least it acts like an array of notes. And this operator is the append operation. So we'll append the new note into that array of notes. That'll automatically assign the task ID to this note, and it'll try to save the note in the database. If it works, we'll redirect back to the task notes path with a notice. And if it doesn't work, we'll render new. Now, this is not calling this method right here. We're just choosing a view to draw. We're choosing which HTML we want to send back to the browser. And we're going to use this new view. And this at note now has all the errors added onto it. So when we go back to the new view, this note here will now be a note that we tried to save in the database but couldn't, and the error messages will show up. Now, one thing that I did add, I forgot to add this in the previous video, but if we want a little message on top when there are errors, we can do an f.alert message and say, please fix the errors below. And we'll see the errors here. So now they'll see a little more instruction on what to do or why their note wasn't saved in the database. And we'll also add this onto our task form as well. So now you can see when I try to create a task that isn't valid, we'll see this, please fix the errors below, and it will be highlighted. We'll have another task. And then we can go to the task, we can go to the notes, and we can try to create a new note. And if we try to leave the title blank, unfortunately, our browser doesn't let us submit this, but we can add a title and we can create it, and it's all working. Now, off camera, I went ahead and implemented this show action. Now, it doesn't look like I did much, but I did add this before action load note. and it's set for the index, new, and create, just like in our task controller. And the load note finds the note by the params ID. And since the note is the last thing in our URL, we're gonna use the ID instead of notes ID. So that's because the Rails router, this number right here, the way you get this number is with the task ID, and the way that you get the last number is just with the ID. There is some HTML here. I took it out. Now I'm saying render the note. So it's going to be the note. And again, this is a note model. So it's going to look in the notes folder for the note partial, and it's going to draw up this HTML. You can see I also did a link to unless current to the task note path. And then our show view will print a title, render out the note, and we also added a link to be able to go back to all notes. So you can see that we're on the task notes path where we can see all the notes for this edited console task. We can click on a single note and we can see that, and we can go back and see all of our notes again. And again, this link to unless current is preventing this from being a link that goes right back to this page. So since our edit and our delete actions are pretty much the same as they were in our task controller, I went ahead and completed them off camera. So what I did is I added an edit and a delete button on the show view for our notes. And for the edit link, I use the edit task note path, and we have to pass in both the task and the note for it to be able to get the IDs of both of them into the URL. Then also the button to delete is a task note path. And we're doing the method delete like before, and we're also using our confirmation message. And we also add a class and to make the button red. Now you can see that I took the form that was in the new view out, and instead I put render form because I put the form into a partial like we did in the task controller. Then in my edit view, I render out the same form, and I have a link to cancel, which just goes back to the note. Now my notes controller, I added the edit method, which looks like it doesn't do anything, but these before actions do run. We load the task out of the database through this method, and we also load the note out so that we can drop the form to edit a note. And then the update action that gets called when we submit that form, just like in the task controller, we try to update the note, and if it works, we redirect to the task note path. And this is another shortcut that you can do. You could do task note path and pass in both of these, or we can just pass in this array. And through introspection, Ruby on Rails is able to get the ID of the task and the note and generate the right URL. And we also have a notice saying note updated. And if it doesn't work, if we're not able to update the note, then we'll render out the edit action with the status unprocessable content. Now, I believe I forgot to put status up here as well. We didn't see that error because right now the browser doesn't let us submit a note without having a title. So we're not actually able to test this code, but we do want it there in case another browser might let someone submit it. And then finally, for the destroy action, we take the note out of the database. And again, the update and the destroy load the task and the note through the before action filters. And we destroy the note and redirect them back to the task notes path with an alert saying the note was deleted. So we can edit a note, and we see that the note's been edited. And we can go back to all of the notes. We can do a new note saying delete me, and we can delete that note as well. And we get the note deleted. So all that is working, and it seems like we're done. However, there is a very big security hole in our code right now. So we'll go back to the task, back to all tasks. These are all the tasks. And if you note, there is an alert message task. And we also have a edited console task. So I'm going to edit this one so we can make sure we tell the difference. We got a first task, and then we got an alert message task. So let's look at this alert message task, and let's look at its notes. We see that we got this as an alert message task note and a new note for the alert message task. And I created those off camera, but if we look up here on the URL, we can see that the task is 4, so the ID of the alert message task is 4, and the ID of the note is 6. Going back to the first task up here, when we go to its notes and we're viewing a note, we can see that the first task ID is 1 and the note that we're viewing is 1 as well. But what if our user goes up here and tries to view this sixth note? So he goes up and modifies the URL, and you can see that we're actually seeing the note for the alert message task, which does not belong to this first task. It might not seem like a big deal right now, but let's assume that some of these have private information. And if we have multiple users and they're able to view notes that don't belong to them, that they didn't create, are leaking out information to other users. And what if these notes contain credit cards or something sensitive? So we want to make sure that users can't go up here and view a note that doesn't belong to the task that they're viewing. So the reason why it works just fine is when we load the note out, we just find the note by its ID. So we're able to load note 6 out without worrying about whether it belonged to the task or not. The way we fix it is we do the at task.notes.find, and this will limit it to notes that only belong to this task. That way, we won't be able to view notes that don't belong to us. Just a quick gotcha. You got to make sure you put these before actions in the right order. Since this one is first, we'll load the task before we try to load the note. If we try to load the note first, then at task will be nil, and then we'll get an error message saying we're trying to call notes on nil. So we need to make sure that the before action load task is first before the load note. And now if we refresh, remember note 6 does not belong to task 1. If we refresh this page, we'll get a record not found. Now this looks like an error, but it's actually exactly what we want to have happen. A record not found is a 404 error. And as you know, 404 errors means you're trying to view a page that doesn't exist. So if the user goes up and they mess with the IDs and the URL, trying to view someone else's notes or tasks, they'll see page not found, and that's exactly what we want to have happen. Now, once we deploy this to production, and then they wouldn't see an error message like this. They'll just see 404 page not found. Now, before I end this video, I just want to point out that right now there's a lot of clicks the user has to do to be able to see the notes. So they're viewing a task, they have to click the notes button. If they want a new note, they have to click the note. If they want to see this note, they have to click on that. And so there's a lot of clicks that they have to do. Now, it is possible to be able to combine these views into one. So right now we're viewing a task. This is the task show page. What we could do down here is loop through all the notes and display them. That way they don't have to click on a link to see the notes. We can also put the new note form down at the bottom so that they can fill out and create a new note without even clicking on another link. So there's other ways that you can combine these pages into one so the user doesn't have to click on as many links. That's all we'll do in this video. In the next video, we'll work on adding user authentication.